No, I mean, architecture is political. We gotta have that stuff.
Indeed.
We're tearing down communities to build multifamily, and you have to understand we are creating displacement. You're displacing Black and brown folks, and they don't come back.
Half of this podcast would be dedicated to the history of Powerhouse, my journey and my discoveries, and hey, I'm going to solve this housing problem.
Hey guys, what's up? My name is Melissa Daniels. This is the Architecture is Political podcast where Black and brown folks talk about architecture. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and be part of my storytelling. Located in Chicago, the National Public Housing Museum is the only culture museum devoted to telling the story of public housing in the U.S. Its mission is to preserve, promote, and propel the rights of all people to a place where they live and prosper, a place to call home. Housing insecurities is one of the most prevalent issues of our time, cutting across boundaries of race, class, and religion. The museum draws on the power of place and memory by sharing public housing stories of hope and personal achievement, as well as struggles, resilience, and resistance. Using art, oral histories, and material culture, the museum will archive and share these stories and create opportunities for visitors to understand and engage in innovative public policy forums in order to re-image the future of our communities, our society, and the places we, again, call home. I had the pleasure of talking to Tiff Beatty, the current program director of arts, culture, and public policy at the National Public Housing Museum. She's also a cultural organizer, a performer, spoken word, an artist, a host, art administrator. What can't she do? In this episode, we get to know more about Tiff and the museum as well as the projects that she's doing. I found out that this museum actually existed through the podcast that they have called Out of the Archives. I don't know if I was just searching for a new podcast or what, but the stories being told, and it's not just Chicago Housing Project. This is, again, the National Public Housing Museum, so they touch upon all across the country. I began to think about my own personal stories, and not just currently with the research I'm doing, trying to find out my neighborhood and growing up there and the history of the building and of the neighborhood, but my own interactions. You do get a glimpse of, if you listen to any of my previous podcasts where I'm talking to, like the one about architects and displacement, my experience with the balcony and my fears and traumas. But I was also thinking about the happy stuff. What made this unique for me? What made this home for me? I remember we had a record player, and my mom would have Caribbean music playing. And I remember that on Sunday, she would clean the house and the music would be playing. I remember my next door neighbor, I used to babysit and I used to take to school. I remember trying to look him up to see what he's doing today. He has a very unique name, so he's probably going by his middle name. But I remember taking him to elementary school and he would come to my house and we would play. I had a Nintendo and we would come over either my house or his house and we would play Nintendo games. And then I remember when I started middle school and high school, he got really sad because he's like, well, now you're an adult, you won't want to play with me anymore. And I was like, oh, well, you're right, because I discovered boys and I want to play with big boys my age or older, babysit some kid. But, he was very right about that. So it's memories, the good stuff. Those type of memories. It's not all fear and horror. And talking to Tiff about what other people have experienced and the entrepreneurship too. And I'm trying to think of any entrepreneurial stories that I may have. And I don't at all. I wish I had, but I don't. So check out their podcast. Check out the National Building Museum's Out of the Archives podcast, as well as their mini-series of Legally Stolen Inequities for Sale. We touch upon that and Tonika Lewis Johnson's art installation and project. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Here you go. TIFF, how you doing?
I'm great. I'm good.
Tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So I wear a few different hats. I think the title that I've held for the longest is spoken word poet, which I started in college way back in like 2005. So I've been doing that for a minute now. Really, just on the amateur sort of poetry scene, but I have started to take myself a little bit more seriously. And one of the recent poems that I wrote actually was, unbeknownst to me, sort of a job interview for my current job. So it's kind of funny how poetry led to my job at the Public Housing Museum. So now I work at the National Public Housing Museum, and I've now gone from writing poems about my own experiences and some of the people and activists that I've met to actually doing this work with an institution, which has just been really great for me. So my current title is the Program Director of Arts, Culture, and Public Policy. So I work with the programs team and the oral history team, as well as our entrepreneurship hub, which is very different for me and for museum, just in general, to be doing entrepreneurship stuff along with history and also contemporary arts, working with our Artist as Instigator project. So that's just sort of a nutshell what I'm into, what I'm interested in, and kind of how I got to where I'm at now.
You're currently in Chicago, but You're not from Chicago.
Exactly. Yep, you caught that. So I'm originally, I was born and raised in Tacoma, Washington. So that's where I grew up, just south of Seattle. And I went to school so that's in Western Washington. I went to school in Eastern Washington at a small liberal arts college called Whitworth University, small Christian school. So like by my senior year, I had not traveled and I was ready to get out of there. So I did this program, which was basically a domestic study abroad program. So it was a group from Chicago that came, and they were like, you can come to Chicago, you can do an internship, see what it's like to live in the city, get experience with the cultures and the communities there. And so that was like exactly what I was looking for, because there was like no culture around me where I was. So I was ready for that, came here in 2007. Went back home for a little bit, just that summer, to kind of work and figure out my next plan. And then I ended up coming back here working for that organization, doing internship programs and immersive experiences for mostly college students, but also some other groups.
Was there a culture shock for you?
Coming to Chicago?
Yeah.
Yeah, in the best way possible, honestly, because I got the opposite when I went to college. Like Tacoma is, it's pretty diverse for the Northwest, which is predominantly white, but just going to Spokane, where it was even more white and less diversity and less institutions that were owned and operated by people of color, coming to Chicago and just seeing the political power, the history, the art scene, and all over the city, different cultures. Like I was definitely like, whoa, I did not know this existed. Never thought about Chicago before that. And so just coming here was really, really life-changing, especially the spoken word scene. Like I come from, might have caught that through the Christian school thing, but I come from a Christian background, and going to a Christian school just sort of pushed me a little bit in the opposite direction. And so coming here, I really wrestled with like bringing my authentic self, with knowing that that's how I grew up and that's a big part of me and my identity, but also I was changing and I was shifting, and Chicago sort of allowed me to do that. I met some really cool Christians here who were not like the Christians that I grew up around, but I also met people who were doing poetry on the spoken word scene, and that felt like church to me. So I ended up sort of going more the spoken word route. And now I'm sort of playing with some ideas of how to really stay true to that history and tell that story of Christianity and how I see it as really a culture space, even when it comes to conversations I'm in now about preservation. Black people and Black churches, they always have a building fund, it's like,
right.
It's real. It's about the space and creating spaces. That's what I see as my role in programming. So it's all connected. Yeah.
You kind of morph and changed. Chicago has allowed you to do that. How did that affect you interacting with natives there?
Like how has me changing or?
Well, it's okay. So I'm born and raised in DC. Then I went to school in Boston for a little bit, and I came back and my dialect changed. And so they're like, where are you from? And people like trying to guess where I'm from. Mm-hmm. So I don't have that DC talk or DC slang or whatever. When I was in Boston, I kind of picked up POC and the little... Like you say pop, it's just a little slang. So you're
I got a friend from Boston.
So I'm kind of curious, like, how did that change you and how did that affect your artistry.
Like at the museum, interacting with residents?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, even just in general. Like even
just in general.
Yeah. With natives there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it definitely has been interesting. It's probably not even something I've been as conscious of, but when someone does say something like, oh, you said that with the Chicago accent, I'm really like, even people from here will say that. When people from home say it, okay, I get it. You're around each other all day. But when somebody from Chicago says it, I'm like, really? Like, I mean, it is a badge of pride in a lot of ways. The fact that a lot of people do assume I'm from Chicago. I mean, I have been here. I'm not gonna like say the years again, but I have definitely been here for a while. And in a lot of ways, it is home. I think a big part of what helped my transition in Chicago and sort of helped, well, I don't know, you'd have to ask other people, but I think for me, my perception would be the thing that I did intentionally to honor Chicago, to honor the spaces that folks created and welcomed me into, was to try to host my own space for people to be welcomed into, to feel comfortable, to bring something different to the scene in Chicago, particularly the South Side. So I lived in Hyde Park, which is on the southeast side of the city. If you know about Chicago's geography, that's like near the lake. So there's a beautiful park called Promontory Point, and it was actually, my family was in town and we ended up going to that park. And I go there I had always gone there because it was like literally walking distance from my house, but I had never thought to use the little fire pits that they have in the park. And my aunt, she loves the barbecue. We're there late. She gets some wood. We're going to start a fire. And so we had this just really normal, but also because it was in Chicago, because it was the only time my whole family had come, it just felt special to me and meaningful. And we stayed there long enough to where people started, joking and telling stories. And I had heard stories about my paternal grandma meeting my mom that I had never heard before when they first met. And I was just like, this is crazy. Just because we're sitting around a fire, we're getting this experience. We're in a new place. We're getting this experience that we've never gotten before. And we've clearly known each other our whole lives. So the next year I hosted the first event, which I ended up calling Art is Bonfire, which is obviously a play on words because I'm a poet and I just like to play with words, but it's a bonfire for artists. And it's really about the community that really made me feel like home in Chicago, which is the South Side spoken word community, which overlaps a little bit with the North Side and the West Side because nothing's pure, but very much South Side, predominantly folks would come, but then people from the West Side would come and we get around the fire, and I've never made a s'more before. They've never been to the lake before, and they grew up in Chicago. So the fact that I could show people in Chicago something that they hadn't experienced before, and just us to all be a part of it together. And yeah, people just embraced it. I ended up doing it for, I think it's now 12 years.
Wow.
So it's something that's, just every summer I did it 3 to 4 times a summer, just bringing people together out there at the park.
How I discovered you was on Instagram, and I don't know what popped up in my feed. And I was like, wait, there's a National Public Housing Museum? Like, that's what? Did you say the same thing when you were applying for this job?
That's a good question. I had heard about the museum, and honestly, like I probably wrote it off as like, because I just hadn't really actually known that people went to it. It felt like this thing was more of an idea, which for a long time it really was. And when they got the building, we haven't even moved into our building yet. We haven't even started construction. And there were literally articles. I probably went, like the media probably influenced me without even knowing it too, because there were actually full page sort of front cover, who would actually go to a public housing museum, asking that question, because it was just so like, really, is that really a real thing? And it has been like a couple years where the museum has said, like, we're going to open in 2 years. We're going to open in 2 years. We're going to open. So it's kind of one of those things. But being here, being a part of it at this phase is something I never really imagined. Just because it has been just such a natural thing. It wasn't like I went out looking for it. Like I knew the executive director from her previous position. She used to work at this. She was executive director at Hull House Museum, which is dedicated to the history of Jane Addams. And now like we're building a museum in the Jane Addams Homes, which was public housing, but it was named after Jane Addams. So there's just some really great connections in terms of things that I'm interested in, women's rights and histories, and also rights for Black people and poor people. And the fact that Lisa, who's the executive director, is also not only interested in history, but also how contemporary art can play a role. And so all of that stuff just really aligned. I don't know if I can take too much credit for it.
Another thing attracted me to was the personal stories and how important that is, documenting the oral histories. You do that well with your Out of the Archives podcast. How did that brainchild come about?
Yeah.
Did you think of it and started it?
I wish. Although I did help refine it. It actually started, I think, like a couple of months before I started. It started the month before the pandemic as an in-person listening series. So there was no plan to make it a podcast at all. So when the pandemic hit, which a lot of people had to just figure out, okay, how do we work in this new normal, so-called. So they basically were hosting that in February, took a break, and then kind of tried to bring it back. I think it was April, May, maybe, as a Facebook Live event. So people would show up and ideally interact with the guests. And there was actually a really successful episode, but a lot of them were not so successful. From there, we were just playing around with ideas. What's the most precious part about this whole program, and how can we emphasize that and uplift that? And for us, it was the stories, as you're saying. The stories are powerful. We want people to focus on listening. We don't need to have all kinds of cool visuals and slideshows to accompany it, to make it a visual thing. It's primarily audio. We're building an oral history archive. Our archive's not public yet. So this is about sharing the stories out before it's public, just to get people interested in, and also to understand what we're building. So we just really sort of focused on making it the best audio program, audio content that it could be. And it just keeps getting better. I think we're actually now sort of experimenting with adding a bit more narration and narrative to kind of tie the stories together. And yeah, we're going to be releasing that later this month. So there's lots of experimentation that's happening at the museum, which is like the moment that we're in as well, which is exciting.
Has there ever been a story that got to you, it sticks with you to this day? Or
Yeah, for sure. I think you want me to share it? Or I mean, I obviously can't give it justice, but I can just like say what I can, and hopefully I won't butcher it. So I don't know. We have this, it's one of the Out of Archives series, and it's also probably because I've used it a lot, but whoever curated it just did a really good job, because I mentioned that we have a entrepreneurship hub. So the stories are all about entrepreneurship in public housing residents that, you know, we're entrepreneurial. So it's not always about like a business, starting a business, running a business out of your home, although a lot of people did, you know, have candy stores or sell food, barbershops, hair salons, all of that happened as informal economies and still does. But this episode also included stories of a guy who was telling a story about how him and a friend went to a nearby suburb, and they just went to hang out, I don't know, go to the movies or something. And one of them ended up spending all of the money on candy. So they had no way to get back home. So what did they do? They literally, all they had was like their backpacks with some like paper and pencils, and they started to draw people on the street. And, you know, people gave them donations for the drawings that they did of them, because they had that talent, and they used it, and they got the money more than the money that they needed to get home. And so that's just one of the many stories. But that was just one to just kind of remind you that there's just so much there, that we all have stories but it's very rare that particularly marginalized folks, poor people, Black people, get to just kind of be human and just tell something that happened random to them when they were a kid, and have people actually listen to it, which is just really cool to me.
That's genius. What I would do in that situation was walk, right?
Right.
I'll just start walking. Right. And to stop and think that I have this talent of drawing people, I could sit here and draw and just ask people for money and get money. That's as a kid.
Right.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh. Part of your series also is Legally Stolen. How did that come about?
Yeah, can't take credit for that one either. But I love doing it. And I love collaboration. That's probably my favorite thing. So this one is a real collaboration. But the name of it, the concept of it, came from Tanika Lewis Johnson, who's the artist as instigator at the museum. That's a residency that we created a couple years ago, but she is, as a part of that residency, she's building this project, Inequity for Sale. So Legally Stolen is one aspect of Inequity for Sale. The primary piece of the project is the art installation, which is, she's calling landmarkers, because her original idea was just to get the city to actually recognize housing discrimination. But of course, like, that's going to take way too long. So why not just put some art there for now, and also tell a story in a way that an artist can, and, you know, a government putting up a landmarker can't necessarily. And so that's the installation. And then we're doing these podcasts, just tell people the stories behind the installation, which is really all about just how it sounds, legalized theft, which happened because the government has been complicit in housing discrimination. Real estate speculators have been complicit. All of these different stakeholders, banks, lenders, have basically all agreed that it's okay to take advantage of Black people. And in the 50s and 60s, there was a specific practice called land sale contracts, which in combination with redlining just allowed speculators, which are people who basically bet on the real estate market, buy something for cheap and then sell it for more. So they were buying homes from white people and scaring them out of, blockbusting, scaring them out of the neighborhood, and then turning around and selling that home. And you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes because they weren't, the Black homeowners weren't actually homeowners, because the contract stipulated that the speculator who bought the home from the white person was still the owner of the home. So it was a contract, not a deed. And the Black people could be kicked out of their homes at any point if they were late on a payment or, anything, if they missed a payment. There were very, very harsh kinds of restrictions in those contracts. It really prohibited the amount of wealth that was able to be built in Black neighborhoods, and we're still seeing the impact of that today. So that's what that podcast is all about. It's 3 episodes, playing around with maybe a 4th, but that's not really decided yet. But we don't want to stop doing the project, is what I'll say.
Was this the first time you heard about this, or you heard it before?
I heard it before. I heard it in a new way this time, but that program that I went through, the Chicago Center, which was the internship program, they were, and they still are, I'm on the board now, but they're amazing with teaching college students about these kinds of histories of communities. And so we actually did and they still do the South Side tour, where they don't just drive around and just talk about, point out things that may be interesting or exciting, like, oh, there's a shooting over there, or like, I saw that on the news. They really talk about these kinds of things. Or other communities like Woodlawn, which was a similar sort of situation, but the people who owned the homes would really turn a 3-flat into a 6-flat. So they would put 6 families in there instead of 3. And then that's, why some people weren't counted in certain censuses, and just so many things that happened that most people don't learn about, even Chicagoans. And I was fortunate just to be in that program. But I mean, that stuff doesn't really stick with you in the same way of when you're doing an art project. You know what I mean? Like, the way that I'm experiencing the information now is just completely different.
You heard about all this. Were you mad? Were you pissed off? Were you like...
Yeah, I mean, definitely. We know the facts. Even if we don't know the facts, we know how Black people were treated and still are treated in this country. But to see the homes, to talk to people who live in the community now who are still going through it. And I want to own a home one day. Like, I'm thinking about this not just in the past, but it's also my reality. And it makes me feel stuck. I've done all this to go to college and to get middle class or whatever. Not that's the goal, but it should be something that is possible for me as much as it is possible for someone else who wants it. Basically, it's the way housing is used as, really, it's taking us back to monopoly. It's like, it's used to literally take money from some people and give it to other people. Mm-hmm. Like, that's just as simple as it is. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Stealing,
exactly. Legalized stuff.
You mentioned before that the current building that the museum is in is temporary, and a new one you have the site already, you have the building already, and it's also, you're preserving an existing, it was a project or housing project. Do you have any information on that? Or
the building
itself? And
know that it was the Jane Addams Homes. It was a part of a collection of complexes called ABLA. Each letter represents a name of one of the places. So the A is for Jane Addams, but there were 3 others. Some actually still exist in that neighborhood, but the Jane Addams Homes was huge, like so many people that no longer live there that grew up there. And it was built in 1938, and it definitely continued to deteriorate when Black folks started to move in, and was eventually torn down like most public housing in the country, and particularly in Chicago.
When people talk about public housing, aka the projects, one of the things that comes to mind is like the Pruitt-Igos, the things that I didn't know about in watching that particular one. is that it didn't start off that way. It was like hope and
Right.
the government is for the public in the
well, and it was predominantly, it was a lot of white people at that time too.
Right.
And it was segregated too.
Have you been approached or people have ever talked about the stigmas?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, some people don't even necessarily believe in the museum who are public housing residents. We should just be honest about that as well, because some people don't want to preserve that history. They left and they want to move on, and they think it was a terrible thing because they had a bad experience. And that's real too. As the museum, and particularly with programs like Out of the Archives that represent the stories of the residents, we want to have all of it. Like, we want to tell the full story, not just the happy story or the reason why public housing was important, the communities that were there, but also it was hard. There was definitely neglect and there was violence, but how did it get that way? Tell the whole story. We don't necessarily need to provide commentary on people's perspectives, but just as long as we're providing a broad array and are being accountable to the community. So thinking about ways to structure our programs, our oral history programs, so there's a feedback loop, so that we are not, museums are typically seen as gatekeepers of like what's good and what's bad, or what's worth collecting. But all of that process, even to the items that we collect, have been collaborative and are ongoing in terms of asking the residents, what are the objects that we should have in the everyday objects exhibit, for example, and developing partnerships with folks around the country so that it's representative of the country as well.
It's not just Chicago public housing. Do you have a list? Do you go to HUD and get the list, or like how does that work?
Yeah, it's called NARO. There's I don't know if it's called a consortium or whatever. There's just like a collection, national organization that they host conferences and things like that. So we go to that. But we also have from the beginning had public housing residents and public housing leadership on our board. Public housing residents are the ones that advocated for this museum to become for this building to become a museum. And so, yeah, just working with those folks and like building out from there. We have board members who weren't in public housing, but work at housing authorities, people who just work in communities, who are activists in communities or advocates for housing rights. So yeah, it's really a lot of grassroots connecting, organizing, and yeah, just kind of being a part of the conversation.
Exhibits, how do you select them? How do you do the programming for that stuff? Is it a month long, year long? Is it themed? Like, how do you do it? How do you figure this out?
I wish, my previous job, actually, when I first started, it was a once a year festival, which to me, that was so exciting because I love to spend a really long time on one thing and just really just get into it. But that's not really how this museum works. And we're still figuring it out. I mean, a lot of it is because we're like small and we're nimble and we can sort of be more flexible. And we're still experimenting, figuring out what is our programming and what are our exhibitions. I do have Artists as Instigator fully under my umbrella. There's a lot of installation because I'm not really an art curator, so our executive director is, and so she kind of takes most of that. But the Artists as Instigator project is under my umbrella, and I selected Tonika, who I talked about with Legally Stolen and Inequity for Sale, because we had actually worked together before, and she was just like telling me about this idea, and the stars aligned. The fact that I went to work at the museum at the same time I was having these conversations with her about her new project that she wanted to get off the ground. Because I knew about the project, I was like, oh yeah, that would be perfect for the museum. So we just sort of made it work. That's just how a lot of stuff happens, is by convenience, synchronicity, whatever you want to call it. And really moving forward for that project, I would love to see, and I'm working on this, developing it as not necessarily an application process, although there would be something that they would have to submit, but doing an open call for artists to submit projects that could possibly be incubated under the Artists as Instigator residency, as long as it connects to our mission of housing as a human right and tries to connect arts, culture, and public policy. It's interesting to us. So it would be kind of fun just to see if we opened it up, who would apply and what kinds of ideas we would get. And then that would also expand just our connection to artists and the art world, which I would love to do.
Can't wait to hear about that when it comes out. Any other outreach programs that you would like to mention?
Well, I mean, I guess a lot of the reason why I think we're different than a lot of other museums is who we represent, who we're for, and the social justice aspect of our mission. So it's not only about us hosting programs and inviting people into the museum, but it's also about being out in the community, whether it's an Equity for Sale installation, which is actually in Ingle, the community that it's about, or going to things that are in neighborhoods or in communities, that so not always expecting people to come to us. So one of the things that we like to get to, at least in Chicago, because that Chicago's our home ground, and so just at least being committed to showing up for the public housing reunion picnics, for example. Like every summer there's a picnic for every public housing community, and they bring, because their buildings a lot of the times are no longer there, they just bring people to the space where the building used to be, and they gather and they have a picnic. Some others that still exist, they still do the same thing. It's like, it's the culture, and we show up, and usually they let us say something on the mic or just hang out and eat. But yeah, connecting with our board members to help us connect with those communities, and just kind of being, like I said, being out there, being at conferences, being in these spaces that's half of it. Like the other half is trying to think of interesting stuff to share with other people.
Mm-hmm. Architecture, do you think it's political?
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. I think everything is political, though. We're human. We're always trying to, I don't know, I don't want to say manipulate the system, but we're always trying to get our agenda across, whether it's as an individual or a community or a group. So I think if you have a collective agenda, to me, that makes it political.
Have you interacted with any architects or know any?
It's funny, because of the world that I'm in, the architects that I interact with are not your typical architects. The people who are working on this Inequity for Sale project, they're designers and architects, and they're fabricating a sign and thinking about all of these like things that I can't be in most of their meetings, but I know them from like equity fellowship stuff. They come with just a different perspective, I guess it would be called community-centered design, participatory design, thinking really about how design and community intersect, and how to create spaces that support public engagement or connection. So I think about circles a lot because of my artist bonfire thing, like ciphers. I love the circle. You can sell me on the circle way over the stage. Like, I don't want to be on a stage. But yeah, I think about it in terms of space of, again, how do people interact with the space? Who's the space for? Does it feel like it's for the people that it's for? And yeah, I mean, I think the ideas and the background of the person who designed it are absolutely important too. Also, did you spend the money that it takes to make this the highest standard quality possible, which I think, also is something that I think about in terms of some of these issues around housing. Poor people not only deserve safe and comfortable homes, but also beautiful homes, and innovative, thinking about green energy and all of that stuff. I don't know about that stuff, but wherever I can connect, like, I love to be a part of that whole movement.
Going back to housing is a human right, I think that was on the website too. I never thought of that until recently. And I don't know, it was the pandemic. I don't know, it was just being home more and social mediaing more, but it becomes more and more apparent that is not the case here in the US. Do you think that public housing would solve that problem?
In some ways, I don't know if it would completely solve it, but I do believe that government has to be a part of the solution. Government is the representative of the people, and that's the only entity that we can really force our will on. I mean, it takes a lot of people, it takes a movement, it takes a lot of different types, but I think it's built into our system to do that kind of advocating with government and not with private entities. So when public housing becomes more privatized, the people, and this is like proven with the conversions it's called RAD, it's acronym for something, rental something. I don't know, but
I used to know this too.
Basically, it's like, yeah, I know. I'm like, I should know this. It's late.
Should know this too, because I did that.
Rental assistance demonstration, something like that.
Rental assistance demonstration.
Something like that. Yeah, that's it.
I had to Google it. Sorry.
Okay, good. Okay. I was on the right track. But yeah, so my point was, though, so RAD has actually taken power away from public housing residents, because with a lot of, I think most public housing, I know it's true here in Chicago and places like New York, public housing has leadership structures. And so they have building presidents, and they have advisory groups and folks that, for whether for better or worse, like can sort of wield power. And with these kinds of programs that privatize public housing, there's no kind of representation that's anywhere near the way that it was structured in traditional public housing. And so, yeah, it's not only the buildings that are being torn down, but it's actual community governance structures that people have really, in some ways, benefited from. And some, you could argue both ways, but I think at least there is a system that is transparent that we can influence. Unless you have money, there's nothing you can do with this wave that's coming.
Yeah, that's all I have.
Yeah, I mean,
I would like
to
go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know if you take questions too, but I would like to hear like maybe more about like your public housing background, if you still feel connected.
Oh yeah, I was actually going to ask you if you have any questions for me. A little bit about Melissa. Yeah. So I started this podcast, Architecture is Political, where Black and brown people talk about architecture. Mm-hmm. I named it that because when Black and brown people inhabit space, it becomes political. Mm-hmm. Policies get created when we inhabit space, and they don't want us there for the most part. Mm-hmm. My personal story, I grew up in the housing projects in Washington, D.C. I'm in Maryland right now, but it's not too far. And I decided to study architecture because I felt that people should not live in the conditions I lived in. Mm-hmm. No one told me that architecture has nothing to do with public policy. But I love the field anyway. So that's the gist. I am researching where I live. Found out the architect was a woman. Found out that we were under the urban renewal area. What else? That Black churches got together in the neighborhood, and they had a strong say in that neighborhood. And Black church was the developer.
Yeah. Wow.
Thank you so much, Tiff, for coming on.
Of course. Thank you. This was a pleasure. So it was great to meet you. Connect.
Same.
Look forward to the episode.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
All right. Talk soon.
Listeners, I have an exciting announcement. I decided to launch a membership program for the show, where you have a chance to support me and the show directly. I love creating the show, and it means the world to me that you all tune in to keep hearing me week after week. But it takes an immense amount of time and energy to produce. I want to keep the show going, and I want to invest in its growth. And I also want you to become a partner with me in this journey. That's why I'm excited to give you a chance to officially become a supporter of the show at glow.fm/archispolly, ARCHISPOLLY, or by clicking the link in the show notes. It's quick and easy. It takes less than 30 seconds and just takes clicking a link in the show notes and using Apple or Google Pay. You don't have to create any new logins, and you can contribute as much or as little as you like. If this show is part of your day or week and you like what I'm doing, then visit glow.fm/archispolly, all one word, and support me and the show in any way you can today.